what I'm going to be showing are pictures of my most recent work, which has been embroidering on photos from my archive. Like many people during lockdown, I had to change what I was doing. I could no longer fly around the world photographing. And I started going through pictures and decided to make quilts as an edit of pictures from different places I'd been and embroidering some of the pictures. I find it easier to talk to an image than to talk to a room. So I'm going to move on. Oh, and I would just want to say how fantastic Giles's talk was and what an impossible act to follow. But there are many overlaps, and I hope I can keep up the momentum that he created from such impressive work. The first picture I've put up is from Greenham Common from '84. So I'd spent a couple of years driving up to Greenham, spending days there, joining in actions and photographing. And it was just when I was beginning to be a photographer. I'd had a checkered past up till then. I'd lived in Brazil, I'd taught English, I taught urban studies, and then suddenly I became a photographer. And I was fantastically lucky to be asked to join a women's photo agency. And in the early 80s, there were a number of agencies springing up. Magnum, of course, was the role model. That was already 40-ish years old. But network photographers and Format followed that model as cooperatives. Format's unique selling point was that it was all women, and Maggie Murray and Val Wilmer were two well-established documentary photographers who decided they wanted to work with other women. And for people here who are photographers, I think, it can be quite lonely. It's a sort of mixture of when you're working, you're engaging with people, you're being intensely social, but then there's a lot to do by yourself, and a lot of it is you, the single photographer. So I've got great belief in agencies. Unfortunately, most of the agencies I've been involved with have fallen apart from my present one, Panos Photographers, which is going strong and has a particular ethos and commitment to social documentary. Anyway, back to Greenham Common. And as you'll see, what I've done is I've added sewing to my picture. And I think as photographers, we have to think outside the box, to use a terrible phrase, but as photography's changed, as the world's resources are disappearing. When I was taking pictures in the 80s, I was using film. I can remember going to Bolivia in the 80s, in the middle of up a mountain, talking to a miner who knew the price of silver on the world market. And this is back in the 80s when there was no internet, no easy way of getting communication. But the miner knew that silver was valuable, that he was digging out of the earth, valuable commodity, and knew what it was worth. Unfortunately, that is a diminishing resource. And like most photographers, I've got a room full of pictures, and what do you do with them? And my plan was to, my eureka moment during COVID was to get them printed on material and sew on them, creating objects rather than just a two-dimensional image. And Greenham was one of the first ones I'd done because it was a history that was important to me, both as beginning my photographic work and also as a protest against the American base at Greenham Common. And at university, I was a child of I was born in 1948, so I'm quite old, but I went to university in the 60s, and by a stroke of luck, I got into Sussex University. I got into Sussex University because the professor who interviewed me was a very keen sailor, and I just sailed with my brother from Le Havre to Portsmouth, and we sailed a small boat with no navigation equipment at all. So I really sympathise with refugees in small boats. This was a small boat with two of us in it. And I got a place at university, totally out of my depth. And I think I spent my life being out of my depth. With photography, I'm out of my depth. It's fantastic to see Martin Parr here, who's been an influence to all my peer group, I think, who knows what he's doing, or at least I think he does. And I always feel like, oh, I've got the wrong lens, I've got the wrong setting, I should have knelt. I'm a Libran. We find it impossible to make decisions. And for me, photography is a minefield of deciding what you shoot, how you shoot it. But I suppose my only point of reference is to do what you believe in. And I've always felt that photography can show people things. Anyway, enough ranting. Nicaragua, Che Guevara, 1960s. What a role model. I believed in, revolution. Still believe in revolution. We need more. And when Nicaragua had a revolution in the late 70s, in 1979, and the Sandinistas took over, a lot of idealists from all over the world went to this small Central American country, which until then had just been known as America's backyard, thanks to the dictator Somoza, who was very much in league with America. And I think it was Johnson who said that Somoza's son of a bitch, but at least he's our son of a bitch. And that was the sort of attitude to this small country that's one of its resources was coffee, and then a group of young people, and men and women, the Sandinistas, launched a revolution, took over the country, and then by the time I went there in the early 80s, there was a lot of idealism. I think it was the first time I saw beekeeping projects. I can't remember some of them, but there were lots of people with ideals came and set them up in Nicaragua. There was also a country with a lot of poverty. And at the same time, there was also a solidarity group. And I like working with people. And the Nicaragua solidarity, El Salvador solidarity, Guatemala solidarity. I belonged to so many solidarity groups at one point, but they were a point of getting into a local community, working with people on the ground. And so I went to Nicaragua with the support from the NSC. Last week we had a dinner in London. 45 years later, we met up, and although Nicaragua is now a disaster in our terms, Daniel Ortega, who was one of the young Sandinistas, has now become a terrible dictator, but the country is still there. This is from a burnt-out coffee farm, and of course these are tactile objects. It's a bit, I'm shortchanging you by showing you a photo of them. I have made a little book of some of them, and they're there, so you can see them in their 3D-ness. But many of these, the images were used in the 80s. They were used by the Solidarity campaign. And then they've lain in files in various agencies. They've not seen the light of day, because how often do you need a picture from Nicaragua? Anyway, I hope that by adding embroidery to pictures, I'm giving them a different sort of value. And also, making them into objects. Okay, an important bit of my past was going to Brazil. As soon as I left university, 1971, left university, saw an advert in The Guardian. And I must be one of the few people who still buys a newspaper every day. Anyway, I know there are other options, but saw an advert for inexperienced teachers to go to Brazil. You didn't need any experience. They wanted new graduates to go learn how to teach and to go to Brazil for 2.5 years. I actually spent 3 years there. And that was such a formative experience. Living in a military dictatorship, it teaches you a few things. Not all pleasant. My students would disappear. I wouldn't know what had happened to them. I think living with fear also gives you a push. You realise that you have to do something about this. I've also been to Amazonia several times working for NGOs later on, and I find it impossible to photograph the immensity of the lungs of the world. And again, in this picture, I've added embroidery. And yes, sort of jumping ahead, after a lot of years of just funding trips on my credit card, working with solidarity campaigns, I started to get commissioned by NGOs, who for me were brilliant: Oxfam, ActionAid, CARE, Save the Children, partly because they were an access into communities. Through them you met local people, and you got taken to places. I think it's fantastic now that local photographers are being able to do that work. I said Giles was a hard act to follow, but there are lots of links, and one is the fact that now that Oxfam, I don't think would fly a photographer from Britain to Brazil, but would use a local photographer. Like many things in my life, like having a free education, I was also a beneficiary of a rather colonialist attitude to photography, where you did get sent places. And I've always tried to do my best to, share my knowledge, to get local people involved with things, to explain what I'm making pictures of and why I'm doing it. So these are, in a while we'll come to the quilt, so I took individual pictures from my archive. There's the most wonderful, I think they're wonderful, company called Contrado. I started off trying to print things myself on my printer, which did work, but used a lot of ink. And during COVID, it was really hard to find printing ink. But Contrado will print anything on anything. So you upload your photos and you specify the sort of material you want, and it comes back a few days later. So these are all pictures that I took from a commission to sit on a little island in the Amazon for a week, eating bananas every day, because that was the only food, and living with local people. And because I'd lived in Brazil, I speak Portuguese, which converts to Spanish badly. So these are a selection from that. So what I did during lockdown was I went through my prints, took out 6 from each country, got them printed, and then added some sewing, and then I sewed them together. Unfortunately, I haven't put these together in order, but the quilts will come along in a minute. In 1988, I was introduced to Eritrea because Tom Stoddart's dad, I think, was taken ill. A press trip had been set up with Alistair Campbell, who was a journalist at the Daily Mirror at the time, with Glenys whose husband was expected to become Prime Minister, didn't happen, but anyway, was still a belief in that. And a TV crew from ITN and one from BBC. So we were really a press trip going to Eritrea, which at the time was at war with Ethiopia, wanting to set up an independent country. Part of my career seems to be going to countries that are on the rise, have a revolution or have a big change, and then go downhill. Not my fault, but it's a bit worrying. Anyway, this is from Eritrea, which I went to during the war as a very big battle was happening, and then I've gone back several times afterwards. Iraq is another story of 2003-04. I went just after the bombing had stopped. And there were all these photos of Saddam. And none of these have been published. But I just thought it was amazing how people had, as soon as they could, defaced the ubiquitous images of Saddam Hussein. And so I made them into a quilt. This sort of image relates to what Giles was saying about photographing very sick children, babies. This was also an MSF nutrition unit in Niger, which is an amazing country with an amazing amount of problems. One of these was because of people not having access to food and babies starving. And I've honoured it by sort of adding sewing. You might think it's a terrible idea, but anyway, that's what I've been doing. And on the way to the MSF centre, passed by a group of boys swimming. I just love this because it's a side maybe that you don't see so much of Africa, which is people having fun and as you know, children all over the world play. You can play with nothing. You play with in your environment, with what's available to you, and the pleasure of a swimming hole and swimming. And the sort of downside of the environment in Niger is vast tracts of land being emptied, soil erosion. And I did a sequence of pictures of trees. This is also from Niger, of birds' nests in this tree, which I think is rather wonderful. I was meant to have a little exhibition in a bookshop in Arles, but this week. But unfortunately, the lady who was organising it didn't get back to us in time for it to happen. But that's why I sort of did an edit of trees. And I spend a lot of time photographing protests of one sort or another. This is from the protest at Euston Square in London against HS2. Is it HS2? Yeah, the train line, which involved cutting down these trees to build the car park, which was completely unnecessary. A couple of years ago, over Christmas, a number of protesters burrowed into the area that had been fenced off and went up into the trees and set up a camp in the trees. So this is one of the protesters abseiling between trees in Euston Square. And this is also from the tree section from Palestine. This is actually Bethlehem. And Gideon showed us really moving pictures of olive trees yesterday from Greece and from the aftermath of the fire in Greece. And this is the one solitary olive tree left next to the separation wall, which isn't the most remarkable photo, but I hope I've done it justice by adding a bit of sewing. Okay, in keeping with being an old lefty and do a lot of protesting, last weekend I found myself in Parliament Square. There was a protest for Julian Assange, who is about to be deported for his WikiLeaks activity, who spent 5 years in Belmarsh prison. There was a group of Sudanese women protesting against the war in Sudan. And there was Just Stop Oil, all going on in one small area. And I haven't put any other pictures in here. And this is from 40 years ago. But I love going to protests. I mean, I suppose it makes me feel part of something. It's in a very naive way. I think I'm making a difference. Of course I'm not. But I felt that by recording it, it's a testimony of history. And I think that's really important. And it's important what format have done. And my pictures from Greenham have actually been in the Radical Landscape exhibition that was at Tate, Liverpool, and is now going to Walthamstow, which I'm very pleased about. And that is through the Bishopsgate Institute, which, if none of you know it and live in London, is an amazing resource, has a fantastic librarian, Stefan, who collects works. And another thing I'd like to plug at this moment is Café Royal Books. I don't know if you're all familiar with them, but I think this is another amazing endeavour. What's great about the world of photography is how people do things. They create, whether it's Giles doing his Legacy of War charity, or whether it's Craig who does Café Royal Books, which I think is such a valuable resource. Anyway, I could be quite passionate about archives, importance of keeping stuff and then trying to get it out. And with the photography, that's what I'm doing. Coal, not dole, not a very popular sentiment now, 40 years later, but at the time, the miners' strike was a phenomenal uprising in a way. And I think the artist who recreated the Battle of Orgreave, Jeremy Deller, thank you, Martin. Yeah, Jeremy Deller. It's amazing that happened. I mean, those of us who lived through the 80s, unbelievable how the country has changed and what Thatcher did, what subsequent has happened. Right. Gilles talked very eloquently about Rwanda, and I'd worked in Rwanda just before the genocide, which was horrible, a really difficult assignment where I'd gone from Ethiopia to do some work for a small charity. Just after the genocide, I went back to find people, and everyone I'd photographed had been killed. And I then started working with Africa Rights, which was a brilliant NGO set up by Rakia Omar, an amazing powerhouse of a woman who's the sister of Rakia Omar, the TV journalist. What a family. Anyway, Rakia set up Africa Rights and wanted to collect testimonies from survivors from the genocide. This is actually Esther, who was working with Oxfam, who is an incredible woman who lost her husband was massacred. And one day I was with an Oxfam driver and we're driving along a road and we saw people digging up earth, and he went very quiet. And then we went back to the Oxfam office, and suddenly Esther was in tears. And she knew that the black bags they were digging and putting stuff in black bags. And she knew that was her husband, was one of those people, that the driver, who was a friend, knew that's where Esther's husband had been murdered. And it does take your breath away, and you feel so powerless. And how do you console someone who, she was devastated because she'd been told that they wouldn't disturb his bones, and now they were being dug up to take for a commemoration. Anyway, that's Esther's story. And the genocide was in 94. 20 years later, 94, 14, I went back to find people I'd photographed for Africa Rights, and Specios was one of those who liked the story that Giles told, had lost her child, had her child murdered at birth in a hospital in Kigali. And I went and of the people I'd photographed in 94, I found 20 of them and put together a piece of then and now. But for this particular quilt making project, I've just decorated some of the images from the earlier one. Okay, enough talking about quilts. This is one I put together of images from South Sudan. I think they're quite messy. I quite like it because it's craft, because it's doing something with your hands. I was going to rant a bit about digital photography and how many images there are in the world. And I looked on the Alamy site, and they upload 100,000 pictures a day, which is just like, who has the time to look at all those pictures? And that's just every single day. Why have I started on that? Sorry. Anyway, this is South Sudan, and pictures from the archive, then sewn together. Oh, and the messiness of it, which I also quite like. And the great thing about sewing is you can do it with other people. I did a workshop a couple of weeks ago in Oxford with refugees, which took quite a lot of organising, but through Asylum Welcome, we had a group of Afghan, Syrian, and Ukrainian refugees who all sent me a picture. I got Contrado to print it out, and then we went back and we did the sewing together. And it's such a great community activity. And sometimes life isn't about big statements. It's about, just like Giles cooks with people, it's about doing things with people. And sewing can be communal. This is the Eritrea quilt that I made. And for me, it's important to put them onto a piece of material that comes from the original country. And the picture in the bottom left-hand corner is from the cover of my book, which was of a woman fighter, Lem. It's a picture that's used a lot in Eritrea, apparently. Eritrea has not the happiest place, as we know from the number of people trying to leave it, as there's compulsory military service of many years, which is why, and a really bad economy. So anyway, those are my pictures from Eritrea. These are the ones from Nicaragua that I've put together. And this is the protest one. So the miner is there, Greenham Commons there, Fireman's Strike, I Can't Breathe, which was graffiti on a wall after the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, and the trees. And this is Amazonia. So they're quite big, these, which is also nice to work on something that's physically large. And I've made 20 so far. And they will be at an exhibition at Farley Farm at the Lee Miller Archive in Sussex, together with a series of Afghan faces And Afghanistan is a country quite dear to my heart. The way in which some places and cultures get under your skin. And I first went there in 1988 with an all-female film crew to make a film under the then Russian occupation, and have gone back a lot of times since. I couldn't believe it when the Taliban came back. I'm horrified at women suddenly losing their freedom, their rights. And so I made a series of pictures with dedications to different groups of women. So this one's dedicated to poets and writers. This one's dedicated to girls who study. This one is dedicated to victims of violence, domestic violence. This is young women and their dreams. And this is to women embroiderers. So what I've done is I've taken my old prints, I've painted out the background with acrylic, then sent them off to the wonderful Contrado, then they've come back, and then I've added some sewing. And this is dedicated to women working on the land. And that's it. I have also brought a little book I made, which is just to show the physicality of it, which are smaller than the exhibited pictures, but these are a small version of some of the embroideries. Yeah, that's it.